Imagine a world where drugs were the enemy, a world where the mere mention of drugs conjured images of danger, crime, and societal decay. This was not just a personal battle for those addicted, but a collective war that society felt compelled to fight. Drugs were seen as a threat to the very fabric of society. The narrative was clear. Drugs were not just a personal problem, but a menace that could unravel communities, destroy families, and corrupt the youth. This was the narrative spun in the 1970s, leading to the war on drugs. The media was filled with images of drug busts, anti-drug campaigns, and public service announcements, warning of the dangers lurking in every corner. President Nixon declared it. He promised to be tough on crime and tough on drug use. His administration painted a picture of a nation under siege, where the only solution was a hardline approach. But this wasn't America's first brush with drug control. Back in the early 1900s, fears about opium and cocaine led to early drug laws. These laws were the first steps in a long journey of drug regulation and enforcement. These early laws often targeted minorities. Think Chinese immigrants associated with opium dens or black communities linked to cocaine. The fear and prejudice of the time were reflected in the legislation, which disproportionately affected these groups. Fast forward to the 1980s. The crack cocaine epidemic hit. Fear and media sensationalism fueled the fire. The public was bombarded with images of crack houses, addicts, and violent crime, creating a sense of urgency and panic. In response, mandatory minimum sentences were introduced. These laws put people away for years, even decades, for minor drug offences. The justice system became a conveyor belt, processing and incarcerating individuals at an unprecedented rate. This war on drugs wasn't just an American phenomenon. It became a global initiative heavily influenced by US foreign policy. Countries around the world were encouraged and sometimes pressured to adopt similar hardline strategies. Countries around the world adopted similar strategies, often with devastating consequences. The global war on drugs led to increased violence, corruption, and human rights abuses, as nations struggled to combat the complex and multifaceted issue of drug trafficking and addiction. So, after decades of this war, are we winning? The question lingers in the minds of many as the battle against drugs continues to rage on. The answer is far from simple. Drug use persists, and in some areas it seems to be more rampant than ever before. In fact, in many parts of the world, it's on the rise. The global landscape of drug use is constantly evolving, with new substances and methods of distribution emerging regularly. The US alone spends billions upon billions of dollars each year fighting this war. These funds are allocated to law enforcement, border control, and various drug prevention programs. We've locked up millions of people for drug offenses. The prison system is overwhelmed and the human cost is staggering. The US has the highest incarceration rate in the world, with drug offences playing a significant role. This has led to overcrowded prisons and a cycle of recidivism that is difficult to break. But has it stopped drug use? Not really. Rehabilitation efforts are ongoing, but the success rates are mixed, and many individuals relapse. Drug trafficking is a lucrative business. The profits are immense, and the risks, while significant, are often outweighed by the potential rewards. As long as there's demand, there will be supply. The basic principles of economic supply and the demand for drugs shows no signs of diminishing. And the illegal drug trade, much like a hydra, seems to sprout two heads for everyone we cut off. For every dealer arrested, another takes their place and the cycle continues. The war on drugs is a complex and multifaceted issue with no easy solutions in sight. Behind these statistics are real people, real lives shattered by this war. Take, for example, a young woman named Lisa. She grew up in poverty, surrounded by addiction. She started using drugs as a teenager. One day she gets caught with a small amount of heroin. Because of mandatory minimums, she's sentenced to 15 years in prison. She misses her daughter's childhood. She comes out of prison with a criminal record, making it nearly impossible to find a job. This is just one story. There are millions like Lisa's. Families torn apart, futures destroyed, all in the name of a war that doesn't seem to have an end. Section 4. Unequal impacts, the war on drugs and the perpetuation of inequality. The war on drugs hasn't affected everyone equally. While it was intended to curb drug use and trafficking, its implementation has had far-reaching and often devastating consequences for certain communities. It has disproportionately impacted marginalized communities, black and brown communities, the poor, and those struggling with mental health issues. These groups have borne the brunt of aggressive drug policies and enforcement tactics. These communities often face poverty, lack of opportunity, and systemic racism. The war on drugs exacerbates these existing issues, creating a cycle of disadvantage that is hard to break. Drug use becomes a symptom of these deeper issues. When people are trapped in environments with limited resources and support, turning to drugs can seem like an escape or a way to cope with their harsh realities. But instead of addressing the root causes, the war on drugs criminalizes these communities. Law enforcement focuses on punitive measures rather than providing the necessary support and rehabilitation. We've seen this play out time and time again. The same communities are targeted, leading to a cycle of arrests and incarcerations that do little to solve the underlying problems. A young black man is more likely to be stopped and searched for drugs than a young white man, even if they're behaving the same way. This disparity highlights the racial biases inherent in the enforcement of drug laws. This leads to more arrests, more convictions, and more families torn apart. The impact on these families is profound, with long-term consequences for children and communities as a whole. The war on drugs, rather than solving the problem, perpetuates a cycle of inequality and suffering. Section 5. Lessons from abroad. Could Portugal hold the key? But what if there's another way? Some countries have taken a radically different approach to drugs. Portugal, for example, decriminalized all drugs in 2001. They didn't just legalize drugs, they invested heavily in treatment, harm reduction, and social support programs. The results have been remarkable. Drug use has actually decreased, particularly among young people. HIV infection rates have plummeted, and drug-related crime has gone down significantly. Portugal's experience shows that there are alternatives to the war on drugs. Section 6. Rethinking the approach beyond punishment, embracing alternatives. Portugal's model is just one example. There are many other alternative approaches to drugs harm reduction, which focuses on reducing the negative consequences of drug use, such as needle exchange programs and safe consumption sites. Treatment, providing accessible and effective treatment for drug addiction, including medication-assisted treatment, counseling and support groups. Decriminalization, removing criminal penalties for personal drug possession, can free up resources to focus on treatment and harm reduction. These approaches recognize that addiction is a health issue, not a criminal one. They prioritize compassion over punishment. Section 7. The verdict: a war won or lost in the shadows of human suffering. So, is the war on drugs working? The evidence suggests otherwise. It has led to mass incarceration, fueled violence and instability, and disproportionately harmed marginalized communities. The war on drugs has failed to curb drug use. Instead, it has created a global black market, enriched criminal organizations, and fueled corruption. We need to rethink our approach. We need to shift from a punitive to a compassionate approach. We need to invest in treatment, harm reduction, and social support. The war on drugs is a war on people. It's a war we cannot win. It's time to declare peace.